Have you ever walked away from someone and felt, somewhere deep inside, you weren't just leaving them, but leaving behind a version of yourself? Or maybe, someone walked away from you, and later you found out, it wasn't just you they were aching for. It was who they were when you were by their side. This idea might seem dramatic at first, even a little romanticized. But what if it's not just poetic? It's psychological. It's spiritual. And more than anything, it's real. Most people believe the end of a relationship is just about losing connection. That it's about losing someone's attention, presence, or maybe even physical comfort. But here's the misconception: we think people only grieve us. The truth is much heavier. Much more haunting. What if they're not just missing your touch or your presence, but who they became in your presence? Who they were becoming when they were challenged, seen, encouraged, and loved in a way that was raw, uncomfortable, but deeply real? We're not talking about just another breakup. We're not talking about bitterness or playing the victim. This is about identity. About the deep structures of the self that begin to shift when exposed to love with depth. Love rooted in Stoic relationships. Not fleeting infatuation, but a transformative kind of intimacy. And when that kind of presence vanishes, it's not just heartbreak. It's identity erosion. That's what this video dives into. The often unseen unraveling that follows when someone loses not just the relationship, but the version of themselves they touched while they were with you. This isn't about revenge. It's not about self-pity. It's about seeing the truth clearly, something Stoicism urges us to do. Because Stoicism doesn't shield us from pain, it teaches us to find meaning inside of it. So ask yourself this: what if your absence is speaking louder than your presence ever did? What if your silence is revealing something they can't ignore anymore? This isn't a message of vengeance. It's a message of clarity. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll discover why walking away wasn't a loss. It was a beginning. Not just for you, but for the silent reckoning unraveling in the person who let go. Because what's breaking inside them now isn't just from losing you. It's from losing the version of themselves that only existed when you were near. So let's talk about it. Let's walk this road together, not bitterly, but with stoicism. With dignity. With clarity. And with a rhythm that speaks straight to the soul. You ready? 1. The identity that emerged in your presence. They thought they were whole before you. Or at least they told themselves they were. Independent. Self-sufficient. In control. But control isn't the same thing as clarity. And ego isn't the same as identity. Before you came into their life, they had learned to survive, not to evolve. They had crafted a mask, one that could perform, charm, and deflect. But it wasn't until they met you that the mask began to slip. Not because you tore it off, but because you simply lived without one. That's the thing about authenticity, it's disruptive. Stoic relationships don't demand transformation with words, they inspire it through presence. And your presence? It cracks something open. You didn't just give them attention. You gave them space. Space to be vulnerable without shame. Space to say the hard thing and still be received. Space to stop performing and start becoming. And maybe for the first time in their life, they felt seen. Not the version they curated for others, but the version buried beneath trauma, ego, fear. And here's where the shift happened, quietly, powerfully, inevitably. They started to change. Maybe they didn't notice it at first. They started telling the truth more often. They became more reflective. They made better choices, not because you told them to, but because they were stepping into alignment with a version of themselves that felt more real. Have you ever watched someone slowly rise, not dramatically, but steadily, simply because they're around someone who lives with integrity? That was them. And that was because of you. You didn't push. You didn't preach. You embodied something. Something solid. Something that reminded them of what was possible. This is one of the most overlooked truths of Stoicism. We shape each other not through power, but through proximity. And in your proximity, they began to heal. They may have not even realized it. But healing doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it looks like sleeping better, laughing more sincerely, pausing before reacting, choosing what's right over what's easy. You didn't demand perfection from them. You accepted their flaws, but not at the cost of truth. And that quiet accountability, that sacred tension, is what gave birth to their evolving identity. So why didn't they just stay in that presence? Why walk away from someone who made them better? Here's where it gets painful. Growth is not always comfortable. Being seen is not always flattering. And real connection can feel terrifying when someone has spent their life avoiding themselves. You didn't just love them. You revealed them to themselves. And for a while, that revelation sparked hope. They started to believe they could change. They started to believe they were more than their patterns. But eventually, ego fought back. Fear crept in. And instead of rising, they retreated. What they didn't understand was that your presence was a kind of mirror. Not one that magnified their flaws, but one that reflected who they could be. It showed them a higher version of themselves, not some fantasy ideal, but a self rooted in discipline, honesty, compassion. And that mirror? It started to demand something. It asked without words, "Will you step up?" And that question? It became unbearable. Because to rise meant to leave behind everything that kept them small. It meant shedding not just habits, but identities. It meant letting go of comfort, of control. And instead of answering that call, they turned away from the mirror. Now here's the paradox. They didn't stop growing because you left. You left because they stopped growing. You didn't demand anything more than truth. But even truth can feel like too much for someone clinging to illusion. And so they walked. Or they pushed you away. Or they became someone even you could no longer recognize. And maybe they told themselves it was mutual. Maybe they convinced themselves you were too intense, or too serious, or too much. But that's not what it was. You were too real, too steady, too stoic for someone still addicted to chaos. And now? They miss you, yes. But more than that, they miss who they were becoming with you. That version of themselves, the one that told the truth, that slowed down, that started choosing meaning over manipulation, is now slipping away. And they feel it. Not always consciously, but in their restlessness. In the way no new connection feels deep enough. In the quiet ache that sneaks in after the noise dies down. They feel it when they laugh too hard at something shallow. When they post too much. Party too hard. Distract themselves too often. They feel it because their conscience remembers. This is the pain no one talks about. The grief not just for the person lost, but for the self that's vanishing in that absence. And this is why Stoicism is so vital in love. Because it teaches us to value character over chemistry. To choose depth over comfort. To stay grounded when others unravel. You were never there to fix them. You weren't trying to save them. You just offered a new standard. One that called forth their potential, not through pressure, but through presence. And once they tasted that, even if only briefly, they could never unknow it. That's the tragedy. Not that you're gone, but that the version of themselves they liked most was the one that showed up when you were near. And now, without that steady force beside them, they are drifting again. Not because they need someone to complete them, but because without you, they've lost the mirror that showed them who they were capable of becoming. And so, the question that haunts them now is not, "Why did you leave?" but, "Why couldn't I stay at that level?" And maybe they don't have the courage to face that question yet. But the question remains. Echoing. Unrelenting. Stoic relationships reveal our highest possibilities. And once revealed, the soul aches in their absence. You weren't just a love story. You were a turning point. A catalyst. A glimpse into what life could feel like if one lived with more truth, more clarity, more courage. And that feeling? It doesn't vanish with distance. It lingers. It haunts. Because it was real. And real, once encountered, is unforgettable. They're not just missing you. They're missing who they were becoming when you stood beside them with silent belief, unwavering presence, and the kind of strength that only Stoicism can produce. 2. How your departure triggered an internal collapse. They thought they were strong enough to walk away. That they could move on cleanly, without residue. That ending things with you was an act of liberation. But strength isn't proven by how quickly you replace someone. It's revealed by what happens when the noise dies down. And now, the silence left behind by your absence is revealing far more than they expected. Because the moment you stepped away, something inside them began to unravel. And not because you begged them to stay or tried to hold on, but because you didn't. Your dignified silence became deafening. Your calm departure became a mirror. And now, what they're facing isn't a breakup, it's a collapse. This isn't the dramatic kind of collapse people recognize from movies or breakdowns. It's slower, subtle. It starts in the small things. Like their inability to sit with themselves. Like the shallow distractions that used to work, but now fall flat. Like the creeping feeling that something vital has gone missing. And no one around them even notices. You were that vital thing. Not because you gave them a sense of self-worth, but because you reminded them of what worth even means. You weren't just love, you were structure. Your presence gave rhythm to their emotional chaos. Your standards created a container for their better choices. And when you left, that container cracked. Slowly at first. But now, it's widening. They may be laughing louder now. Going out more. Posting with a little extra sparkle. But if you listen closely, not to their words, but to their energy, you'll hear the fracture. You'll sense the dissonance. Because what's unraveling isn't just their routine. It's their identity. You held space for a version of them that they didn't yet know how to sustain alone. That's not weakness, it's human. We all need mirrors. We all need examples. We all need someone whose presence demands our better nature to show up. That was you. And now that you're gone, the scaffolding is gone too. Here's what people don't realize: the self isn't a fixed thing. It's shaped by context, environment, relationship. Stoic relationships, especially, are unique in that they don't manipulate, they stabilize. They clarify. They give you the space to see yourself honestly, without distortion. And in your presence, that's what they experienced. But now, they're drifting. Because without your steady energy, they're surrounded again by voices that flatter, but don't challenge. That validate, but don't correct. That entertain, but don't elevate. And that's when the internal collapse begins to speed up. When no one around you asks for more than the version of you that's easiest to perform. At first, it feels like freedom. No more pressure. No more accountability. Just indulgence. But indulgence without meaning is empty. And that emptiness is what they now carry. Not just in moments of solitude, but even in crowds. Even in new relationships. Even in temporary highs. Because the truth you represented is still echoing in their psyche. And that truth doesn't fade with distance. It intensifies with time. Especially when everything else feels more and more artificial in comparison. You didn't lecture them. You didn't try to control them. You simply lived your values. And in doing so, you exposed what they were avoiding. That's the terrifying thing about being close to someone grounded in stoicism. You can't hide from yourself anymore. And when that person leaves, not in anger, but in peace, you're left with nothing but the truth. Their truth. Your truth. The painful truth that maybe you weren't ready to face what was real. Maybe you weren't ready to be better. Maybe you still thought you could have both, the comfort of lies and the presence of someone who lives in truth. But life doesn't work like that. Not for long. They're starting to feel it now in their relationships. How shallow everything seems. How performative. No one's asking the real questions anymore. No one's holding up the mirror. And even when they look in their own, they can't quite recognize who they're becoming. Not because they've changed dramatically, but because the version of themselves that was taking shape when you were there is now fading. It's not dead, but it's buried. Beneath excuses, distractions, pride. And that's a harder grief to carry than most people expect. When someone loses a good soul, They often don't realize at first what's gone. They think they've lost someone kind, loyal, thoughtful. But over time, they begin to understand they've lost something more foundational. A compass. A force. A gravitational pull that anchored them to what was real. And that's what they're grieving now. Not just your presence, but the way your presence made them feel about themselves. You didn't just love them. You made them want to love themselves better. And now, with you gone, that inner voice has gone quiet too. What follows is not punishment. It's consequence. Stoicism teaches us to distinguish between the two. Punishment is imposed. Consequence is inevitable. When you reject something real, you don't just walk into emptiness, you invite internal chaos. And that's what they're facing now. A chaos of their own making. Not because they're evil or broken, but because they turned away from the very thing that steadied them. And now, they're free, but unmoored. Untethered. Alone in a way they can't explain, even to themselves. You weren't their savior. You never tried to be. But your presence was a framework. A rhythm. A quiet standard that made them want to rise even when it was hard. And when you left, that rhythm was lost. And now every part of their life feels a little out of tune. A little disorganized. A little less purposeful. Because purpose, real purpose, isn't something you chase. It's something you align with. And alignment is hard when the person who helped you see clearly is no longer in the room. So what now? They'll keep trying to replace it. The feeling. The clarity. The container. They'll jump from one distraction to another. They'll rationalize, minimize, perform. But in the quiet, when the lights go off and the music fades, they'll hear it. That internal collapse. That subtle unraveling. The part of them that was better when you were near. And until they face that loss, not just of you, but of the version of themselves they were becoming with you, they won't feel right. Not fully. Not deeply. Not honestly. If this resonates, if you've ever felt like someone's silence told you more than their words ever could, then you understand. You understand that love isn't always about holding on. Sometimes it's about walking away with enough dignity that the silence becomes a mirror. A reflection. A lesson. And maybe one day, they'll thank you. Not because you came back, but because your departure forced them to finally look at themselves. If you're feeling this, if this message speaks to something you've lived, like this video and comment, number 1, below. Let me know you're with me. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. We're going deeper, we're being honest, and we're embracing truth the Stoic way. Because growth is not a trend, it's a transformation. 3. The illusion of control and the reality of consequence. They thought letting you go meant gaining control. That without you, they'd finally be free to live life on their terms, unquestioned, uninterrupted, and unrestricted. But control without clarity is chaos dressed in confidence. What they mistook for freedom was simply the absence of challenge. And now, with no one to reflect their higher potential back at them, they're beginning to see the truth. What they thought was liberation was just a slow descent into mediocrity. Because what they lost wasn't a person. It was the presence that made them examine themselves. And now, with no mirror to hold up, the illusion of control is crumbling into the reality of consequence. They believed they could sever ties and walk away untouched. But Stoicism teaches us that our actions always carry weight, even if that weight isn't immediately felt. They told themselves you were the problem. That life would feel lighter without your expectations. But what they failed to grasp was that your presence never demanded perfection. It called for honesty. And in the absence of that call, their internal compass has gone quiet. Without you, the questions that once challenged their ego are gone. And all that's left are answers built on convenience, not character. You never tried to control them. You simply lived by example. You embodied a kind of steadiness that, over time, made their dysfunction harder to justify. That's the power of Stoic relationships. They don't control people, they elevate them. But elevation isn't always comfortable. It requires the death of the familiar self. And instead of facing that discomfort, They chose what was easy. They chose denial. They chose blame. They chose ego. And now, the price is starting to show. It starts in how they speak. They begin using more rehearsed lines. Surface-level charm replaces sincerity. Humor becomes a shield. They speak louder, but say less. And beneath that noise, their soul is whispering truths they don't want to hear. That they let go of something rare. That they chose performance over presence. That they mistook your accountability for criticism, because they were too attached to being right, rather than being real. And now, each day they live without that accountability, they drift further from the self they once glimpsed in your presence. The most painful part? They thought they'd feel more powerful. But the power they thought they were gaining was only ever an illusion. True power, Stoic power, comes from alignment. From living in accordance with values that transcend momentary validation. And now, the more they chase validation, the less powerful they feel. Because deep down, they remember how you never needed the spotlight to feel centered. How you never had to win arguments to hold your ground. You were calm in a way they couldn't fake. Steady in a way they couldn't mimic. And that steadiness? It made them question their own foundation. But instead of facing the cracks, they walked away from the structure entirely. Thinking they'd build something stronger on their own. But structure without blueprint leads to collapse. And now, the consequences are beginning to compound. One shallow connection leads to another. One unfulfilled night leads to the next. They seek out excitement, but find exhaustion. They seek freedom, but feel fragmented. Because without you, they're chasing a version of themselves they never fully owned. One that only existed in the light you held up to them. You didn't ask them to change overnight. You just refused to play small. And that refusal became a silent challenge. One they weren't ready to answer. They thought they could find someone easier. Someone who wouldn't demand growth. And maybe they did. Maybe now they're surrounded by people who don't question them. Who laugh at their jokes. Who play along. But there's a hollowness there. Because when you've once been seen deeply, anything less feels like hiding. And now, they're hiding in plain sight. They tell themselves stories. That you were too much. That the relationship was too intense. That you just didn't get it. But even those stories are cracking. Because the narrative can't protect them from the consequences. The truth has a strange way of surfacing in the silence. In the gaps between distractions. In the early mornings. In the late nights. In the emotional hangovers after a night of pretending. That's when the voice returns. The one that remembers. The one that knows. The consequence isn't just loneliness. It's disorientation. They've lost their internal north. Not because they were dependent on you, but because you stood for something solid. And now, without that standard, their choices are floating. Detached. Rootless. And with every new decision made in that detachment, the cost grows. Not in dollars. Not in visible failure. But in the erosion of self. In the quiet diminishing of the person they were becoming. And the cruel part? They might not even fully realize what's happening. Because identity collapse isn't always dramatic. It doesn't always come with tears. Sometimes, it shows up as a subtle boredom. A creeping numbness. A loss of interest in things that once mattered. That's the slow decay of purpose. And they're feeling it now. Because they pushed away the one person who made purpose feel tangible. Who made growth feel worth the pain. You were not perfect. But you were present. You didn't play games. You didn't flatter their dysfunction. You mirrored it. And in doing so, you offered them a choice, rise or retreat. They chose retreat. And now, every version of joy they attempt to create without that truth feels unstable. Because you can't build a meaningful life on the rubble of rejected accountability. You can't substitute depth with distraction, not for long. This is the consequence. Not immediate, but inevitable. A slow unfolding of regret. Of realization. Of remembering. That who they were with you wasn't a coincidence. It was a calling. And they hung up before they heard the message. Now, all they have are echoes. And no matter how loud the world gets around them, those echoes remain. You may wonder, will they ever see it clearly? Will they ever come to understand the weight of what was lost? Maybe. Maybe not. Stoicism reminds us to release the need for that answer. To let go of outcomes we can't control. But one thing is certain, consequence doesn't wait for permission. It arrives when truth has been neglected. And for them, it's here now. In the form of identity dissonance. In the ache of inauthentic joy. In the restless nights and hollow winds. What they believed was control has revealed itself as fear. Fear of change. Fear of being seen. Fear of growing into someone new. And now that fear has become their companion. A quiet, persistent reminder that what they abandoned wasn't just you. It was the path toward a higher self. A path they may never fully return to, because the cost of turning back is admitting what they lost. And that, more than anything, terrifies them. 4. The subtle, lingering signs of internal erosion. You might not see it on their face. You won't necessarily hear it in their voice. But if you look closely, really closely, you'll notice something has shifted. Something fundamental. There's a flicker in their eyes, a heaviness in their presence, a subtle tension in how they carry themselves. This isn't just sadness. It's not just post-breakup confusion. What you're witnessing is internal erosion. A slow disintegration of the self. Because when you walk away from someone who gave you structure, accountability, and authenticity, what collapses isn't just a connection, it's the scaffolding of identity that was built in that presence. And without it, the person begins to unravel from the inside out. They smile more now, perhaps even louder than before. They post consistently. Their feed is full of filtered laughter, edited excitement, and captions pretending to be in control. But Stoicism isn't deceived by optics. Stoic relationships aren't sustained by aesthetics. They're revealed in stillness. And in that stillness, behind the curtain, something fragile is fraying. The shift starts gradually. They begin second-guessing themselves more often. Decisions feel less grounded. Their emotions, once tempered by your presence, now swing wider, react faster, and settle slower. The clarity you brought wasn't performative. It wasn't imposed. It was natural, almost invisible, until it was gone. And now, even they can't deny the shift. Have you ever felt more lost, not because you don't know what to do, but because the internal voice that once guided you is suddenly quiet? That's them. They're adrift in their own story. Not completely lost, perhaps, but no longer anchored. Because the inner voice they had started to develop, honest, calm, aligned, was partly inspired by you. By your steadiness. Your emotional gravity. And now that voice has been replaced by static. No one else sees it. Because the decline isn't dramatic. It's subtle. They still function. They still smile. They still check all the boxes of a seemingly full life. But the soul knows. The conscience whispers. And those whispers are growing louder, especially in the silence after the party, the void after the distraction, the stillness after every fake high. They thought losing you was something they could manage. Something they could bury under busyness. But some losses haunt quietly. They echo not in breakdowns but in the slow erosion of meaning. You weren't perfect. But you were real. You didn't offer them constant comfort, but you gave them something deeper, alignment. Your presence didn't entertain, it clarified. It forced them to ask harder questions. Who am I when I'm not performing? What matters to me when no one's watching? How much of my life is built on truth, and how much is built on avoiding it? Those questions don't disappear just because you did. They linger. They press. And now, without you there to help guide those answers, they're circling themselves in confusion. They're not grieving a breakup, they're mourning a mirror. The mirror you held up without judgment. The one that reflected not only their flaws, but their potential. The version of themselves they saw in your eyes, more whole, more centered, more capable, is now fading. And every time they chase connection elsewhere, they're not just seeking company. They're trying to resurrect that version of themselves. but it's not working. Because that version of themselves was forged in your presence. In the quiet moments of being fully seen and still fully accepted. That's what Stoic relationships do. They offer a container where a better self can emerge, not because it's demanded, but because it's modeled. And now, with that container broken, there's a slow leak. A draining of energy, purpose, and direction. They don't even know what they want anymore, not truly. Because clarity requires contrast. And you were that contrast. Against your integrity, their excuses didn't hold. Against your calm, their chaos was exposed. And without that contrast, the lies they tell themselves now feel dangerously convincing. This is the erosion. Not of image, but of essence. Not of performance, but of presence. They're not falling apart in a way the world can see. But inside, they're unraveling. And the scariest part? They're pretending it's fine. They've convinced themselves they're just moving on. But Stoicism teaches us that pretending is the enemy of healing. That we must face what is, not what's convenient. And what is, for them, is a mounting sense of emotional dislocation. A spiritual homesickness. Because you weren't just a person. You were a place. A safe space for their higher self to come alive. And now that space is gone. They reach for new things, relationships, habits, indulgences, but none of it sticks. Because without internal structure, nothing external satisfies. They feel more exhausted than excited, more restless than driven, more emotionally numb than connected. And they may not even understand why. But you do. You understand because you watched it happen. You saw their struggle with truth. You felt their tension when they started to grow and then recoiled. You heard it in their silence when you spoke with depth. You noticed when they stopped reflecting and started reacting. And yet you didn't punish them. You didn't guilt them. You simply stepped back. Stoicism doesn't chase. It observes. It withdraws when needed. And in your absence, everything they tried to outrun is catching up. The regrets. The misalignments. The parts of themselves they buried instead of facing. That's the erosion they're living with now. And no performance can stop it. No distraction can delay it forever. The soul wants to be real. It wants alignment. And when it gets even a glimpse of that, through someone like you, it becomes harder to live in falseness. You were a turning point. A moment of contrast. A presence that made the lie unbearable. And now that you're gone, the lie is deafening. They're not mourning just the absence of your voice. They're mourning the absence of their own inner voice that once awakened in your company. If this part has struck a chord in you, like the video and comment, number 1 below. Let's keep this conversation honest. And don't forget to subscribe, because clarity, growth, and emotional integrity don't come from comfort. They come from truth. And that's the journey we're on here, together. 5. The spiritual nature of the loss. There's a difference between being lonely and being disconnected from the soul. The first can happen when no one is around. The second can happen when everyone is. What they're experiencing now isn't just loneliness, it's spiritual fracture. Something deep inside them knows they've stepped out of alignment, and the pain they carry isn't just about your absence. It's about what your absence represents. You weren't simply someone they loved. You were someone who grounded them in something real, something immovable. You were a moral compass, a quiet force that didn't demand but illuminated. And when that kind of presence is lost, the soul doesn't just feel sad, it feels disoriented. They thought they'd be fine without you. That they could maintain their identity without your influence. But Stoicism knows better. It teaches us that character is not forged in isolation. It is shaped in relationship, in the friction between comfort and clarity, in the discipline required to stay grounded in what matters. You provided that friction, not through confrontation, but through your unwavering integrity. And now that integrity is gone from their life, the map they used to navigate their moral decisions is blurred. They've entered a kind of fog, and even they can feel it, the lack of certainty, the emotional dissonance, the creeping discomfort that surfaces in moments they once considered joyful. That's the spiritual cost of walking away from someone who called them higher. Not through criticism, but through embodiment. You lived the values they only talked about. You practiced the patience they claimed to believe in. You held your ground in moments they would have compromised. And in doing so, you became more than just a partner. You became a lighthouse. The kind that doesn't chase lost ships, but still stands, visible, immovable, quietly offering a path home. Now that you're gone, there's no light to steer by. And in its place is a growing internal silence. One that doesn't comfort. One that accuses. They feel it in their choices. Not immediately. But slowly, subtly, their behavior has started to shift. Things that used to bother them no longer do. But not because they've healed. Because they've grown numb. They've started tolerating things they once resisted. They've started making excuses for things they once swore they'd never do. This is what happens when the soul stops asking for better. It begins to settle. It begins to forget. And that forgetfulness? It isn't freedom, it's moral erosion. And it started the day they chose comfort over truth. When they dismissed the discomfort they felt in your presence as pressure, not as possibility. When they confused emotional safety with control. When they traded the path of self-awareness for the illusion of ease. You weren't the problem, you were the reflection. And they couldn't bear what they saw. Because it wasn't just their flaws being exposed. It was their potential. And sometimes, the most painful truth to face isn't how far we've fallen, but how high we could have risen. You offered them something sacred, the opportunity to evolve. To mature. To transform not through force, but through example. That's the essence of Stoic relationships. They don't rescue, they reveal. They don't fix, they challenge. They don't enable, they elevate. And now that you're no longer part of their daily life, the gap between who they are and who they were becoming grows wider with every passing day. They know it. Maybe not always consciously. But they feel it. In their spirit. In their habits. In the mirror. The tragedy isn't that they lost you. The tragedy is that they abandoned the process of becoming someone deeper, more grounded, more aligned. And now, everything around them feels thinner. Not necessarily worse, just emptier. Their conversations lack the same spark. Their goals feel hollow. Their victories ring a little less true. Because without the internal alignment you help them develop, nothing sticks. Nothing satisfies. That's the curse of awareness. Once you've tasted what's real, the fake never feels the same. They're not grieving a breakup. They're grieving the death of meaning. Because you weren't just their partner. You were their mirror. Their mentor. Their moral anchor. And now that anchor is gone, they are slowly drifting into waters they swore they'd never enter. Rationalizing behavior they once judged. Entertaining relationships they know are empty. Chasing moments that distract but don't restore. And through it all, pretending they're fine. Because to admit they miss you would mean admitting they miss themselves. The self they only knew through you. You see, there's a law built into the soul. A law that says we can't abandon truth without consequence. And the longer they ignore that law, the heavier the consequence becomes. Not as punishment, but as clarity. Life has a way of circling back to what's real. Of confronting us with what we've avoided. And sooner or later they will realize, they didn't just lose love. They lost a version of themselves they liked better. A version that asked for more. That lived with more honesty. That made decisions with more intention. That's the true spiritual wound. The fracture not between two people, but between a person and their own conscience. And unless they face that fracture, unless they sit with the discomfort of what they've lost, not just externally, but internally, they will keep running in circles. Relationships will come and go. Distractions will offer brief relief. But the silence will always return. That echo. That ache. That voice that whispers. You were more when you were with them. You were becoming something truer. Stoicism reminds us that we can't control what others do. We can only control how we show up. And you? You showed up with integrity. With presence. with truth. And that truth didn't leave them when you walked away. It stayed. It lingered. And now, it's doing its work, not as guilt, but as gravity. Pulling them back, again and again, to the memory of who they almost became. Not for you, but beside you. Because real love doesn't ask us to change for someone else. It invites us to rise for ourselves. They may still be resisting. They may still be running. But the erosion has begun. And until they acknowledge it, until they humble themselves enough to admit what they truly lost, they will remain fragmented. Because healing doesn't come from pretending. It comes from truth. And the truth is, they're not just missing your presence. They're missing their own presence. The one that came alive when they were with you. The one that's now flickering, faint, but not yet extinguished. 6. The unspoken grief for who they could have been. There's a kind of pain most people never talk about. It doesn't come from rejection. It doesn't come from betrayal. It comes from potential, lost, squandered, or abandoned. That's what's haunting them now. Not just the reality of losing you, but the quiet, unspoken grief for who they could have become if they had stayed close to the truth you represented. You didn't promise to save them. You never offered to fix their wounds. What you gave was far more powerful, a space where their better self could exist. A space where growth wasn't demanded, but expected, because your presence made mediocrity feel like a betrayal of what was possible. Now they walk through their days with the knowledge, buried beneath the noise, that they once stood on the edge of becoming something more. Not more successful, not more popular, but more whole. More honest. More aligned. And that version of themselves, the one that was slowly emerging in the safety and challenge of your company, is slipping further into the past. Not because it wasn't real, but because it wasn't finished. It was interrupted. And what remains now is the ghost of that unfinished self, haunting them in the moments between distractions, in the echoes of conversations that no longer challenge them. They pretend they've moved on. That you were just a phase. That your intensity was overwhelming. That what you stood for was just a reflection of your own wounds. But that's the lie we tell ourselves when we're not ready to face who we were becoming, and why we walked away from it. You were too real, and they weren't ready for real. Real forces us to look at ourselves. Real reveals the gap between who we are and who we pretend to be. Real asks for courage, not comfort. And courage is a currency many aren't ready to spend. So they retreat. Into relationships that validate their stagnation. Into circles where no one asks them to be more. Into habits that soothe their restlessness but deepen their regret. And all the while, they carry a memory, not of you exactly, but of themselves in your presence. The version of themselves that told the truth more freely, that sat with discomfort instead of numbing it, that reached for something higher even when it was hard. That's the version they miss. That's the person they don't know how to get back. Because here's the cruel irony. You can't recreate that version of yourself in an environment built on denial. And that's where they live now. In denial. Of what was possible. Of what they were offered. Of what they gave up. And every time they feel that familiar emptiness, they look outward, hoping the next thing, the next person, the next distraction will fill the gap. But nothing fits. Because the hole inside them isn't about missing another person. It's about missing themselves. The better, bolder self they were becoming when they were reflected in your clarity. This is the kind of grief Stoicism prepares us for, not through avoidance, but through acceptance. It teaches us to hold our pain with dignity. To look our regrets in the eye and say, yes, I lost something real. Yes, I failed to rise when I had the chance. But I will not lie to myself about why it hurts. And this is why Stoic relationships are so rare, and so valuable. They offer not just companionship, but transformation. And when they end, the loss isn't just emotional. It's existential. They may continue pretending, smiling for the world, laughing louder, filling their calendar with noise. But at night, in the stillness they can't avoid forever, that grief returns. That whisper of who they almost became. And it doesn't accuse. It simply reminds. that better version of themselves still lives in memory. Not as punishment, but as potential. Waiting, hoping, watching, to see if they'll finally stop running from what they could have been. You didn't take anything from them. You didn't leave them broken. You gave them a mirror. You handed them a glimpse. And what they do with that glimpse now is up to them. But you must keep walking. You must keep growing. Because the truth you lived by wasn't just for them. It was for you. And even if they never rise to meet it, your journey must not stall. If this has resonated with you, like this video and comment number 1 below. Let's keep telling the truth out loud. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Because here, we don't run from what hurts. We walk through it, with clarity, with strength, and with stoicism. You never intended to become someone's defining memory. You weren't trying to be unforgettable. You were just living honestly, showing up fully, refusing to settle for half-truths and shallow connections. You walked into that relationship offering depth, not decoration. And somewhere along the line, they got a glimpse of themselves they had never quite met before. Not because you imposed your way of being onto them, but because you lived yours so consistently, so authentically, that it made living small in their own life unbearable. That's not ego. That's impact. That's the quiet, profound influence of someone walking with intention and inner clarity. Now your absence has become their teacher. A teacher that doesn't speak in lectures or commands but in silence. In what they feel when they're alone. In what they try to replace but never quite replicate. Because what you gave was irreplaceable. Not because you were perfect, but because you were real. In a world addicted to performance, that level of reality is both magnetic and terrifying. They were drawn to it because it made them feel alive. They fled from it because it made them feel exposed. And in that tension, between the desire for growth and the comfort of avoidance, they made their choice. You didn't leave them because you gave up. You left because they stopped showing up. Because the path they chose was one where truth was inconvenient, where depth was too demanding, where being seen felt more like a threat than an invitation. And now, they're facing the long-term cost of that decision. A cost they didn't factor in when they walked away. Because most people assume the pain of losing someone will fade with time. But this pain? The one they're carrying now? It's not about missing a person. It's about missing the future they sabotaged. The identity they were stepping into. The version of themselves that only emerged in your light. That's the difference between ordinary love and transformative presence. Ordinary love fades with absence. Transformative presence echoes. It doesn't just linger in memory. It reshapes how they see the world. Every new connection now is measured against what they felt with you. Not because of comparison or longing, but because of contrast. The contrast between being tolerated and being truly seen. Between being entertained and being challenged. Between being admired and being held accountable to something higher. And as they move through life, trying to make sense of why everything feels a little duller, a little less meaningful, they may not immediately trace it back to you. They may continue to blame circumstances, timing, external chaos. But eventually, the pattern will become too loud to ignore. And when it does, they'll have to reckon with this truth: you weren't just someone they dated. You were the catalyst. The turning point. The invitation to become someone real. Someone whole. That's what they're grieving. Not just the loss of a relationship, but the death of their own trajectory. A trajectory that was guiding them toward more integrity, more honesty, more peace. And now that they've walked off that path, they're finding it harder and harder to reconnect to any sense of real purpose. That's not your fault. That's the nature of consequence. When we betray what's real, we lose more than connection, we lose coherence. We become fragmented. Not just emotionally, but spiritually. And every false high we chase only widens the gap between who we are and who we once had the courage to become. You might wonder, will they ever find their way back? Possibly. But only if they stop lying to themselves. Only if they stop pretending they lost a person, instead of facing the fact that they lost the environment in which they were becoming someone better. You can't force that kind of realization. Stoicism teaches us to accept what's outside of our control. And their awakening? That's not yours to manage. It's theirs to choose or ignore. But regardless of what they do, your part is clear. You hold the line. You remain steady. You continue walking in truth. Because your worth was never tied to their recognition. Your value was never dependent on their response. You were valuable because you stayed aligned when it would have been easier to bend. You were worthy because you chose clarity over convenience. You walked away not because you didn't care, but because you cared too much to keep lowering your standard to meet their avoidance. That's not bitterness. That's wisdom. That's strength. That's stoicism. Now, as you look back, don't carry the weight of their missed opportunity. Carry the lessons. Carry the clarity. Carry the reminder that your presence carries power. Power to awaken, to challenge, to inspire, and yes, sometimes to disrupt. Because people don't unravel after you leave unless something inside them was only holding together because of the gravity you brought. That's not arrogance. That's awareness. And as you move forward, let this experience refine you, not harden you. Don't shut down. Don't build walls. Build standards. Build boundaries. Build relationships that mirror back the same level of depth you offer. And when you find someone ready, truly ready, to walk beside you with open eyes, open heart, and a willing spirit, you won't have to carry the weight alone. You'll recognize the kind of partnership that doesn't just fill a space, but amplifies your purpose. Because at the end of the day, the highest love is not one that simply makes us feel good. It's one that makes us grow. One that calls us to truth. One that disrupts our stagnation. And if you were that person for someone, if you held that mirror, if you stood firm, if you gave them a glimpse of what they could be, then you've already done more than most ever will. And even if they couldn't rise to meet that vision, it doesn't make the vision any less sacred. It simply means it wasn't their time. But it's still yours. It's still your time to rise, to lead, to embody the kind of truth that speaks without shouting. To live a life that makes mediocrity uncomfortable. To show up so consistently that others are forced to confront where they've settled. That's the legacy of a stoic relationship. That's the quiet revolution of a grounded presence. That's you. And maybe, just maybe, in some quiet moment down the road, they'll remember. Not just you, but themselves. The self they almost became. The self that flickered briefly in the warmth of your clarity. And if that memory becomes a turning point, if it sparks a return to truth, then your presence will have done its work. Even in absence. Even in silence. Even after the story ends. Because the truth never dies. It waits. And so does the better self. Always ready to be reclaimed. Shall I help you format the full script into a video layout or assist with a title card, thumbnail idea, or video description?